Merry meet. So, a few weeks ago on Ask Aislin, we discussed the archetypes of the goddess and how exploring those archetypes can help us gain a deeper understanding of not only the goddess, but also a deeper understanding of ourselves. Now, it's also worth exploring the archetypes of the divine masculine as well. This gives us a richer understanding of divinity, but also a richer understanding of ourselves. So, from the light god to the dark god to the magician god and all of the archetypes that fall under those categories, we are going to be talking about the archetypes of the pagan god in tonight's episode. So, merry meet. I'm Aislin. This is Ask Aislin. Welcome to those who are joining us. So, as I mentioned, this is a companion episode, and I will drop a link in the chat where people can go and they can watch the previous episode on the archetypes of the goddess. But tonight we're going to be talking about the divine masculine, how it separates itself into different forms, and how we can tap into those forms and the various gods that fall within them to explore ourselves, but also to find more balance. And at the end, we'll talk about why would we do this and how would we do it and what would we do with it. So if you are with us live, leave a heart, leave a thumbs up. If you're watching a replay, you can do that as well to help us get this out to the feed of more people. And those, especially those who are live, can leave questions and comments, and we'll have a Q&A at the end, as always. So saying hi to a few people here in the chat. I see Curtis here and Jamie and Taliesin. Welcome, everybody. So we are going to go ahead and dive right in. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about very, very briefly is what is an archetype in the first place, especially for those of you who did not catch the last episode or the previous episode when we talked about the archetypes of the goddess. Now, if you want a more comprehensive discussion of what an archetype is, then I invite you to check out this video. I'm going to put this in the link. Anybody who's watching back on YouTube later, this will also be underneath the video. But this is the previous episode on the goddess, archetypes of the goddess. Now, for those who missed it or those who want a refresher, an archetype is a symbol or a theme that exists throughout cultures. It is cross-cultural. We tend to see these themes have similar patterns within and without the cultures. Now, briefly, archetypes are also can be found in individuals, and they can relate to the human experience as well. But let's start just by talking about a general archetype like the sun versus an archetype like the moon. If we look across cultures, the sun tends to represent hope and joy, inspiration, sustenance, life. It also would align with the yang energy of Eastern traditions, whereas the moon represents mystery, intuition, inner knowing, inner knowledge, the divine feminine, and would align with the yin qualities in some of the Eastern traditions. So across cultures, we see this. This helps lend evidence to the collective unconscious, which is this sort of overarching consciousness that we as humans, as part of the same species, can tap into. And this is essentially where the archetypes exist. Now, as the archetypes descend into the gods and the goddesses, they become more personal to us. When deities take the form of archetypes, or when source energy descends into archetypes and then into the individual gods and goddesses, it makes it more familiar. It makes it easier to relate to. So it can be hard in some ways to understand source. We say that we understand it. It is the source of all things. It created the universe. But to try to personalize it, it can be a little bit difficult. But as we start to work with the archetypes and all of the gods and goddesses that fall within them, it becomes easier. It's more personal, and we can make connections. And some people will even say that deities that we work with, when source descends down into those deities, it feels more personal. It feels like they're like a friend in many ways. So I showed this diagram last time we did the episode, which at this point is now about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And just to bring it back here, We start with source, it descends into the goddess and the god. Some people will work with deity at that level. Some people may work with the great goddess or the great mother and the great god or the great father. It then descends down into goddess archetypes and god archetypes, and then into the individual goddesses and gods. And we can be working at any level here when we're working with divinity. Or when we're exploring the aspects of ourselves. And we can move in and out of these levels too. So sometimes it will make sense to work with source. Sometimes it will make sense to work with an individual god or goddess. Sometimes it will make sense to explore archetypes, right? And then sometimes it will make sense to work with the great mother and the great father. And the beauty of paganism, of witchcraft, of Wicca, and any of the religions that fall under these category, the category of paganism, is that we do have these options, and we can move fluidly in and out of them. So let us kind of dive into the archetypes of the gods, and when archetypes descend into divine energy, or when divine energy descends into the archetypes, I should say, we will often call these god forms. So as I mentioned, there is the great father, the great mother, and then that separates into the individual gods and goddesses. Now we can work with them at any level, just like I said. Now there are three main categories of the pagan gods. So just like the goddess will separate into maiden, mother, and crone, and there is some fluidity in between those categories, the pagan god separates into three different kind of overarching archetypes called the light god, the dark god, and the magician god. And these are just easier ways to categorize the deities that fall into the categories. We'll talk at the end about how connecting to one god and then discovering what archetype that god is part of then opens up a whole world of other deities that we might explore that color that archetype a little bit differently. And so I also made a diagram for us about the god. I wish I'd made one of these when I did the goddess workshop or the goddess episode a few weeks ago. But here we can see the pagan god descending into the light god, the dark god, and the magician god. And really, in a lot of ways, I think the light god and the dark god should be on opposite sides, and the magician is in between, because we're going to learn later that the magician god is very much a psychopomp, meaning that he travels in and out between the light and the dark sides of the wheel and the energy around us. And as a psychopomp, can actually help us communicate with other deities, can help us communicate with the ancestors, with the spirits, with things that are beyond this world. Now, the light god will manifest as the sun god, the sky god, the green god, and the war god. Sometimes putting the war god in the light god category can seem a little bit strange to people, but in a lot of ways, the war god has a lot of connections to the sky god, and it makes sense to put it in this category. Now, the dark god can manifest as the sea god, the forge god, the horned god, and the underworld god. And then, of course, we have the magician god, which in most cases will manifest as the messenger god, but also has a lot of connections to the trickster god and the scribe. And we'll see a lot of overlap here. So this category really, even though we have three kind of main archetypes or subdivisions within it, there's a lot of fluidity here. So a lot of the magician gods and the messenger gods are also trickster gods or scribes. So we are going to dive into all of this tonight. If you ever want to explore it more deeply, you can check out my course, Demystifying Witchcraft, that will be coming out soon for the public. And let us dive in, though, and we're going to start talking about the archetypes of the light god. And I definitely invite those of you who are with us live and those watching in replay, talk about the experiences that you've had. If you've worked with some of the deities that I'm going to talk about, let us know. And if there's some that aren't on my list, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of gods. But if there's some that aren't on my list, we'd love to hear about that too. And you can kind of weigh in on which archetypal category you think that the god you work with falls into. Okay, so archetypes of the light god. So the first one we'll start with is the sun god. And the sun god is probably one of the easiest for us to understand. Coming from the Western culture, many of us were taught some Greek and Roman mythology in school. And and we also just visualizing the sun, kind of understanding what that archetype means itself. The sun is often masculine, in I would say in the majority of cultures, though there are some notable exceptions. For example, Amaterasu is a sun goddess from the Japanese pantheon. But primarily, many of our deities are gods and fall into the divine masculine category. Now, this god is a light bringer, may or may not have the power to create. It may be a creative god that can bring things into existence, but if it, but it at the very end of all of it, at least is the light bringer, bringing positive energy, bringing light to the world. Now, there's some really important qualities that exist within this archetype, and as I go through these archetypes too, you want to think about the kinds of intentions that you have, that you want to work with in your magic or within your spiritual practice. And if you hear some of those qualities listed in any of these archetypes, then that would be an indication that that's an archetype to consider working with. Now, the qualities of the sun god are very healing. So we could go and we could work with one of the sun gods or the sun god archetype in general if we want to bring in some healing energy, knowledge, inspiration. It's very much connected to the fire element. Now, working with these archetypes or with this archetype or any of the gods that fall into it, again, will help us manifest some of those same qualities in our own lives. Now, the sun god is also a great defender of people, which is also probably there's some fluidity here between the sun god, the sky god, and the war god. There's going to be a lot of overlap, and it's probably why the war god again gets categorized into this light god overarching theme. Now, some examples of gods that would fall into this category of the sun god are Apollo, Ra, Balder, Lugh, Mabon, who himself, his name literally translates to the light bringer, Bel, and Surya and Vishnu from the Hindu pantheon. Surya himself being a manifestation of the sun. Now, we can work with the archetype and explore the deities that fall within it. And like I said, you can work with the light god at that level, the archetypal level, or you can begin to work with it at one of these categories, like sun god, and now we'll go on to the sky god as well. But I think that one of the ways to work with any of the light gods, but especially the sun god, is when you want to strengthen the positive masculine within you. And masculine and feminine energy has literally nothing, it doesn't have to do with our gender constructs in our society. It's energy. And we all contain various quantities of masculine and feminine energy within us, and it changes. It changes depending on what we're doing. When we're in kind of a more projective state, we might have more activating energy that we would consider masculine. And so if we want to bring in some of those positive masculine qualities, then this would be a great archetype to work with. Now, the sky god, there is a lot of overlap here. The sky god, though, is connected to the air element rather than the fire element. The sky god is very much also connected to intellect and logic, and is often considered a father figure or a protector. At the same time, though, there's also a kind of an unpredictability with the sky god that we don't necessarily see as much with the sun god. And if you think about weather, right, storms, it's very unpredictable. And so there can be some unpredictable energy here. Oftentimes, the sky god is the consort of the earth mother. And some of the deities that fall into this category would be Jupiter, Zeus, Thor, Uranus, Odin, and Indra from I think it's from the Hindu pantheon. But I'd have to, I don't quote me on that if I'm wrong, but I think it's the Hindu pantheon. Now, we would work with the sky god when we want to strengthen, again, the positive qualities of air within us. And this would be like our intellect and our logic. And so if we want to strengthen those qualities, this would be a great archetype to work with. So, as we're going through, you can think about, again, what are your intentions? I think another place that we can work with both the sun god and the sky god is our relationship with our own fathers. So if you're doing any work around the father wound, these might be to archetypes or the individual deities that fall within them to work with and to help you kind of process aspects of your father wound. And I know in our Shadow Seekers membership, that is what we focused on last month. We were working with the father wound, and we're continuing to work on it as well. But it is a wound that exists for all of us. Everybody, even if we had a father who showed up for us and was there for us, there were times that we were not heard. We didn't necessarily get what we needed, and those traumas can create a part of this wound. But as living in a patriarchal society as well, and being pagans and witches, and seeing the marginalization of people, and seeing the subverging, or I should say, I guess I should say, keeping the divine feminine down, we also have this father wound that is within us, within the collective, of how could a society allow that to happen? How can a society not see that there isn't just a God, that there's a goddess as well? So when we work with these positive aspects of the God archetype, it helps us heal some of that as well. So that would then move us on to the green god, sometimes called the green man. The green god is different than the earth goddess. It has a different energy, though we might work with both for similar reasons. But the green god really represents the transition from the growing to the dying season in a way that the earth goddess doesn't really represent. The green god is often a sacrificial god. He's often a god of the grain. He sacrifices his body. He sacrifices the grain itself that must be sacrificed for the next harvest to come, for there to be sustenance in the next year. Some of our ancestors actually practiced sympathetic magic where there would be a sacrifice of sometimes a human being, sometimes an animal, later effigies, or things that were more symbolic. But there was this understanding that something needed to be sacrificed, something needed to die for there to be life afterwards. And so for that reason, the green god is also a resurrection god. And so in many ways, these resurrection gods, these green gods, of the land, may have influenced the resurrection story of Jesus. And so in some ways, we could even categorize Jesus in this category. Now, other deities that would be categorized here: Dionysius, Bacchus, Adonis. So any god who has that kind of death and resurrection quality would fall into this category. Tammuz, Osiris, Jack in the Green, and I even said, I proposed the idea of Jesus even being partially in this category. Now, we might work with the green god, especially when we're trying to explore the cycles of life, death, and rebirth. Now, we're going to learn as we talk about the underworld god in a bit. We might work with that deity when we're really trying to overcome a fear of death or something like that. But the green god can help us truly understand the cycles of the season and how life and death and rebirth are just different sides of the same coin. So that is the green god. And again, if anybody works with any of these deities, let me know. I put it in the chat, and I seem to. Okay, now I can see more of the chat. So I see Andrea's also here, and Glitter is here, and Rebecca's here. Merry meet, everybody. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the war god. And so this one is sometimes a bit confusing. People would say, well, why would the war god fall into the category of light god? And again, like I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of it has to do with the connection between the war god, the sky god, the sun god. There's going to be a lot of overlap here. The war god is often misunderstood. This is not just a god of destruction in any way. This is a deity that's connected to the element of fire, also associated with sexuality and passion, and can be called on for those reasons, which might seem strange, right? Who I would be calling a war god for that. But very much there's this interconnection between those three qualities. Now, the war god can be a peaceful warrior, but will stand up, will fight when the time is called for. Now, I mentioned this in the previous episode when we talked about the archetypes of the goddess. The war goddess, and there are many that exist, like Kali, and the Morrigan and Matcha, but the war goddess is sometimes thought of more as a defender. So we'll go to war to defend people. We'll go to war to defend the marginalized. We'll go to war to defend those who have been abused. The war god can be thought of as more of an offensive kind of strategy here. So this is a god who will, not to say that it's not defense, but it has more of an offensive energy to it. Now, you might find working with the war god feels appropriate when you are fighting for something that you feel needs to be fought for. So if you are an activist and you are fighting for a cause, this would be a very good god, or archetype, or the gods within it to call upon. Now, the war god might also be called upon, if you're fighting not even necessarily like a larger cause, but you're fighting some other kind of fight within your life where you have to stand up and you have to call in that energy so that you don't get trampled, so that you don't get kind of taken underfoot, right? So some of the deities that fall into this category, and again, all of these are not exhaustive lists, but Mars, Ares, Bran from the Celtic pantheon, and Tyr from the Norse pantheon could all fall into this category. So that is the light god and the various deities that fall within that. So now we're going to segue into the dark god and talk about, so in some ways we think of this as sort of the other side of the coin, definitely not evil, and we'll be talking about that as well. But the first god here, so within this category we have the sea god, the forge god, the horned god, and the underworld god. Now the sea god, like the sky god, can be calm, but also can be a bit chaotic. So just like the sea can be a placid, calm place, the sea can also be a place of great destruction, right? So there is a deep connection to water here. So if you're wanting to really connect to an archetype of the god and also the water element, this would be a good choice for you. The sea god can help us explore more of the hidden depths within us, within the unconscious, because of that connection to water. Can also help us explore our shifting emotions. So, we live in very trying times. You've heard me say this before. We each decided to incarnate right now at this time for some reason. And so it is worth exploring. Why would you choose to incarnate right now in this time? And we have many shifting emotions, shifting feelings that may occur to us as we're faced with what happens out in the outside world around us. And the sea god can help us explore some of that. Now, some of the gods that fall into this category are Poseidon, Neptune, Lear, who is a Welsh god. Again, not an exhaustive list. There are many, many water gods, but not all necessarily fall into the sea god category. There are many gods of rivers, other forms of water. I think that they can fall into this category loosely because of their connection to the element of water. But when we're talking about the sea god, we are talking about kind of a different type of energy. Now, I also wanted to say that it is important to note that there are many goddesses who are also associated with the sea, like Yemaya. Now, they may fall into other categories, and you can definitely go back and check out the episode on the archetypes of the goddess, and you'll kind of learn more about some of the goddesses that are also water goddesses. But also always important to note that when we talk about the sea god, we're not saying that there aren't also goddesses associated with the sea. Now, the next archetype that falls into this category is the forge god. Now, the forge god is very creative, very highly creative, has the ability to shape things, to take things that are in one form and to transform them into another form. So if you're working like with alchemical ideas, if you're really trying to alchemize something within you, transform something within you or something within your life, this would be a good archetype to work with. These gods have great transformative power for that reason, and we can work with them also when we want to learn a new craft. Many of them are craft workers. So, for example, Hephaestus of the Greek pantheon, who's the consort of Aphrodite, or her husband that was given to her, Vulcan, Ptah of the Egyptians, Tubal-Cain, who's mentioned in the Bible and said to be the first blacksmith, the first smith. We might also work with Voland, who is a Scandinavian and worked with in the Scandinavian and Germanic pantheons. But again, this is a good god to work with if there's something you want to transform, if you want to work with kind of alchemy and just transforming something within to something different. Or again, like I said, if you're trying to pick up a new craft. Now, the next god that falls into this category, probably one of the most popular within the pagan community, is the horned god. Very, very popular within pagan culture, I think, because of his, what is the word I'm looking for? The way that the horn god was twisted into the Christian devil. When people come to paganism, when they find paganism, especially if they're leaving forms of Christianity, they will often gravitate towards the horned god because of that very reason, because they understand that this was a deity that existed and was twisted into something else in order to convert people. So his horns represent his great wisdom. He is very much connected to the land. In some ways, we could probably connect him to the green god, though the horned god has less of a sacrificial aspect to him. He just sort of exists. He is very much connected to animals as well, and a protector of animals. Now, like I mentioned, we believe that many sources believe that the horned god was transformed into the Christian devil in an attempt to convert people. Because you have to think about what it would take to convert a bunch of people, how difficult that would be, right? And so to take their revered deity and then instead turn it into this kind of dark and evil thing, it was felt that by bringing in fear will often transform things within people. It will make them go against their own interests when they're so fearful. And we can see that happening across the world, across our history, right? Not just within the pagan community and this particular thing that was done to this revered pagan god. Now, the horned god represents magic, mystery, shamanism, male power, but important to note that this is not power over, as Starhawk talks about the different types of power. The horned god is not about power over people, it's about power within and power together. And then the horned god is also connected to sexuality. Some examples of the horn god: Pan, Faunus, Cernunnos, very popular with many in the pagan community, and also Herne. And then that brings us to the underworld god. The underworld god is very much related to the horned god, especially as Penzak says the two are very much related, and there's a lot of overlap between them for that reason. Now, some people will say that the underworld god is a shadow or a darker manifestation of the divine masculine. And I think that that's a good definition. And I think we also have to pause for a moment to say that darker and shadow does not mean evil or bad. And it just simply means more connected to the unconscious, more connected to the transition from life to death. These are gods who can guide us in a quest for healing because of the connection to the underworld, just like the underworld goddess. They can be called upon for our shadow work. They can be called upon for in order to get closer to our own inner wisdom and knowledge. They can also be called upon to face our fears, in particular the fear of death, which is an underlying energy for a lot of people, even when they don't realize it. So some gods that fall into this category are Hades, Pluto, Nergal, who is a Mesopotamian god, and Osiris. But any god who has a story that takes place in the underworld would be considered an underworld god. Now, finally, we are going to talk about the magician god. In particular, we'll spend most of our time talking about the messenger god, and then we'll talk about how that energy changes a bit in the trickster god and the scribe, though, again, there's a lot of overlap here in the magician god category. And so the magician god is a shaman. So this is a god who can cross between the veils. And I mentioned earlier, this is also, the magician god is also a psychopomp, which means because he can move in and out between the veils, he can also aid us greatly in any troubles that we might have connecting to deity. So if you are somebody who finds it hard, finds it difficult to connect to deity, you feel a little lost sometimes when it comes to that, you might consider working with a magician god first, or working with it now, to see if that changes things for you. These gods, because these gods are known to not only help guide souls through the veils and help bring messages back and forth, but they also help us communicate with the other gods and goddesses. Now, what's really fascinating is that in some cultures, there is a god who we would say falls into the magician god category that is called before other deities are called. So in many Hindu households, Ganesha has a place in the house even if the house worships a different deity. And so when you are working with Ganesha, Ganesha is called first before you call other Hindu gods and goddesses. And personally, in my own coven's practice, when we call a goddess and a god, we usually call the goddess first, and then we call the god second. But if we were working with Hindu deities, Ganesha always gets called first because he helps us communicate with the other deities. And then after that, we can call Lakshmi, or we can call Kali, or we can call any of the Hindu deities. A similar thing is seen in the god Alegba of the Yoruban pantheon. So he is called first, and oftentimes his permission is even asked. Can I have the permission? Could you help me communicate with some of the other deities like Yemaya, for example? And people may offer coins and gifts to him to aid them in being able to communicate with these other gods. Now, the magician god, as I mentioned, is often associated with the trickster god as well. There's a lot of overlap, and also with the scribe. Now, as the messenger god, we see the messenger in the Egyptian gods both in Mercury and Hermes and Ganesha, like I mentioned, in Anubis, Odin, and Alegba. Now, the trickster god, Hermes, also would be considered a trickster god. Here we have Anansi, the spider god. We have Loki, we have Coyote. Any of the tricksters would fall into this category. And then as a scribe, we have Thoth, we have Anansi again, and we have Nabu, who is a Sumerian god. Now remember, again, these are not exhaustive lists. I'm just giving some ideas. And as you listen to this, whether live or back in replay, you can think about some of the deities that you work with and what category do you think they would fall into. So I want to sort of move now into why would we choose to work with the god archetypes? Just pausing to check the chat here. So I see Jen is also here. Elizabeth said she loves Hermes. Yeah, a very, very popular god as well. And great as a messenger god. And again, like I said, great for those who are having trouble connecting to other deities. Okay, so why would we work with the god archetypes in particular? So first reason, I think, is to heal our relationship with the divine masculine. I would say about a month ago or so, someone posed a question during, it was actually as a comment on a post that I had made, and it really kind of struck me, and sometimes these comments will come in, and then I mull them over as I'm walking, or I'm hiking, or I'm meditating. And the question was, is it hard for people to connect to the pagan god? Like, is it harder to connect to the pagan god than the goddess? And I throw that out to you as a question for you. Do you find it do you find it easier to work with the goddess than you find it to work with the god? Do you work with both in your practice? Do you only work with one or the other? So these are questions, and I love I love talking, but I also love hearing what other people have to share. So I kind of throw those questions out to you as I start this segment of the episode. But I think that we, those of us who come from a Christian background, and honestly, growing up in the Western world, it's pretty hard to escape the influence of Christianity. So even if your house growing up was not a Christian household, it's really hard to escape that thread that's in society, that's in Western society. And some would say that that is even deepening even more. There are people who want to make Christianity a religion that everyone has to practice here. But for those of us who have had bad experiences in Christian churches, who have had trauma, from being a Christian, from not being accepted, from being kind of thrown out of the church, and my own story of wanting so badly to be confirmed, and loving God so much and Jesus so much when I was growing up, and I wanted to be confirmed. I wanted to be a member of God's church, and then I was rejected because I didn't go to youth group and play games on Friday nights. And I remember this was a big break for me. It's what led me here initially, to a pagan path. But thinking about God doesn't reject me. I knew it. I knew it very deeply that He didn't reject me. But yet this man-made construct had rejected me. And so many people have not my same story, but they'll have similar stories to tell about being rejected by the church for various reasons, because of who they were, or because they didn't fit in with the crowd, or just even listening to the sermons sometimes, and being troubled by the fact that the divine feminine is missing, or she is subverted down into down below the God, right? And so for those of us who have suffered religious trauma, working with the God archetypes when we're ready can be a powerful source of healing. We can find, many of us find comfort in the goddess instead when we first come to the path, because we're rejecting something else, right? But we may be missing a significant and important aspect of our own healing when we don't also explore the God archetypes. So that would be kind of my first thought of why we would work with the God archetypes. And of course, anybody who's struggling with kind of fresh religious trauma, you have to do something like this in your own time. It's nothing that that you should be forced into or feel you're forced into. But if you ever come to a place where you're like, maybe I do want to explore healing that aspect, that religious trauma, or just the trauma of being in a culture that does subvert the divine feminine, right? You can often find great healing in exploring the archetypes of the god. Now, another kind of related reason to work with the God archetypes is in the fight against the patriarchy. The patriarchy itself is not about men and women. It's not about having enemies or anything like that. It's really a system that has created a hierarchy of people that says that some people are better than others, that are more important than others. And I think that when we as pagans, at least I hope most of us, when we search within ourselves, we know that that's not true. There's nothing that makes us better than somebody else, right? But the patriarchy tells us that it is. It tells us that men are better. And it tells us, too, that there are only two categories. There's men and women, and there's nothing in between. And yet I think that many of us who search our souls know that some of this isn't true, right? That some of this is a construct that has been meant to take the goddess, to put her underfoot, to make her in religions that are, those monotheistic religions that say she doesn't have any place at all. Or sometimes when she does have a place, well, she's got to be a saint, or she's got to be like below the god. And that can be so painful. It doesn't matter what gender we are. It can be so painful for us when we know inside that's not true. We know that the goddess is just as important as the pagan god, or the god in general, right? And so I think that working and healing that aspect, working with the pagan gods and the archetypes of the pagan god, can help us work through some of that collective trauma of the patriarchy. Now, the pagan god existed alongside the goddess for millennia, but it's only in the last few thousand years that one is elevated above the other. And working with the goddess and working from this perspective doesn't mean we're elevating the goddess over the god. And that's the whole point of this episode. It's to find value in both. And I think many of us who come to this path know that to be true. Now, I think another way that we reason to work with the pagan god is to explore aspects of ourselves. Because we do, like I mentioned earlier, we do have masculine and feminine aspects all within us. And to explore some of those aspects, or when we have an intention that we're working towards, whether it's justice or it's healing or it's knowledge or it's as overcoming the fear of death. When we have these intentions, we can find the archetypes that fit with those intentions, and then we have this whole group of gods and energy that we can explore. So I think that's another important reason for working with the archetypes of the pagan god. And then another reason would be to find balance within the masculine and the feminine energies within ourselves. So in Eastern practices, we talk a lot about balancing the yin and the yang. We can't be all yang, all fire energy all the time, and we can't be all yin, water energy all the time. We want to find some kind of happy place in the center. And so working with the pagan gods and the archetypes of the pagan gods alongside the archetypes of the goddess will greatly help us find that balance within. And again, kind of the final reason to work with the archetypes of the pagan god would be to help us discover new deities to work with. So if you have a deity that you feel very much connected to, then you can discover other deities within that archetype, and it opens up this richness for you, because each of these deities, they have similarities to them. That's why they're together in that archetype, but they also have differences, and some of those differences are cultural, and some of those differences are just in the stories, in the myths, and so there's a richness, a great richness of the human experience that can be found when we explore these archetypes, and we ask ourselves, how does that archetype relate to me right now? How does that archetype relate to other people around me? How does that archetype relate to what's going on in the world? And that, to me, helps us find that center. It helps us find that knowledge and that wisdom, which is what we're here for. We're here on a path of learning. We incarnate in order to find something, to transform and evolve and to grow. And in some lifetimes we don't grow as much, and others we grow a tremendous amount. I think that anybody who finds body mind witchcraft is on a path of self-discovery and self-transformation. And so I think that working with the archetypes of both the goddess and the god can be very valuable in not just your shadow work, but also in your just experience as a witch and a pagan. So I hope that gave you some food for thought, some things to think about. And I am going to move now into the Q&A, okay? Now I have this notification about my battery, only having 9% left, and my charger's in the other room. So we're gonna see how far I can get before I gotta go swap it out. But I'm gonna go ahead and start with a couple of questions that that were left for me. We'll start with those. Anybody who is here live is welcome to put any questions in the chat. It doesn't have to be about deities or archetypes. It can be about anything related to witchcraft, shadow work, energy work, and I'll answer all those. And if you're watching in replay, you can also leave questions, and I go back later and I answer what I can. or what I feel called to answer then. And those questions I think that will benefit other people, I'll add to next week's episode. So let us start with a question from Tia. Initially asked it, and then Tara said she's interested too, and I'm going to imagine there's a lot of people kind of interested in this. And the question is, any recommendations for shadow work and for books related to shadow work or shadow magic? And it's a good question. It's one I get asked a lot. My answer is always kind of the same. Unfortunately, a lot of the books that I read were textbooks I read in grad school when I was studying Jungian psychology. That's where a lot of shadow work initially comes from. But so I always start by sharing this book. It's called Meeting the Shadow, The Hidden Power of the Dark Side in Human Nature. It's a book of many different essays, including essays by Joseph Campbell, Jung, some of the main writers in kind of shadow work and exploring the unconscious and mythology. So it's a very good book. It's kind of dense. Like I said, it is a textbook. You can still find it, though, on Amazon and different places. It's not too terribly expensive. But a good book to start with if you first of all, I guess if you like kind of denser, heavier information, but a good source to start with. Is where I learned a lot from this book. Now, as far as books that are more related to paganism, even though this book is not necessarily about shadow work, this is The Temple of Shamanic Witchcraft by Christopher Penczak. It's in his temple series of books, so the inner and the outer temple of witchcraft, that I often recommend people read when they are starting out on the path or they just want to explore it more deeply. This is part of that series. I think this is the third book in the series. And though it is titled Shamanic Witchcraft, there is a lot of shadow work in it and a lot of deep exploration. So a very, very good book, especially for those who are kind of want to look at shadow work and shamanic witchcraft, or shamanic work from the perspective of witchcraft. So very good book. Another book that's interesting that I got many, many years ago is The Mysteries of the Dark Moon. This book is by Demetra George. Very dense, very small print. There's not going to be many rituals, things in that. Like people are looking for spells and rituals and exercises. It's not going to be found in this book. But this book is very good. It talks about the differences between the dark moon and the new moon, which many people are very confused about. How we can use the dark moon energy, deities that are connected to the dark moon, practices that are connected to the dark moon. There's a lot of history in this book as well. I personally loved it. We read it in a book circle years ago, but all very much. I think that this book influenced who I became because when I sort of was elevated to more of a leadership position within my own coven, I started to take this path, like because of my background in Jungian psychology, I started to take this path of doing shadow work, and I began leading people in dark moon rituals where they could explore darker and deeper aspects of their unconscious. And this is one of the books that began my journey there. So I highly recommend this book. Another book, this is one I got a long time ago for people who, I don't know if there's a lot of spells or anything in here. I think there is a little bit more in this book, but this book is called The Shadow Magic Compendium. It's by Raven Digitalis. I got this book probably a couple decades ago, but it's a good book. It's not necessarily all about shadow work, but if you again want to explore the shadow in the frame of witchcraft, this would be a good book to try as well. And then finally, this shadow work journal. I've ordered a bunch of different shadow work books off of Amazon. They seem to be, a lot of them seem to be written by AI, I think, these days. When I got this book about 2 or so years ago, before I began Shadow Seekers, this was one of the only shadow work journals on the market. Now, if you type in shadow work journal on Amazon, you will find 50, 60, several dozen of these. And ordered some of them. A lot of them, they literally say the same thing in different words. It feels like someone just put some prompts into AI and wrote a book and threw it up there. This book, I don't think it's the best book on the market, but it's good. It has a lot of shadow work prompts within it. It does what it's supposed to do. It's a shadow work journal. It will guide you through some prompts. So if you're somebody who needs some more structure and you don't like to just go on the internet and Google prompts, this could be a good book for you. So those are some thoughts, and while I'm here too, because we were talking about the pagan god in this episode, I forgot to show this book is called The Witch's God. This is by James and Stuart Farrar, and it's the Farrar, and it is the companion book to The Witch's Goddess. So if you are interested in exploring the god in more depth, this would be a good book for you. Okay, so let me move on to the next question. And my battery's down to like 6%. I don't think we're going to make it to the end of the episode. So sadly, I'm going to run for 1 second. I know exactly where the charger is, so bear with me. I should have done this earlier, but I will be right back. And let's grab this charger here. This is why it would be great to have a charger in every room, so we don't have to worry about something like this. Okay, here we go. So let me go on to the next question now. So this question is from Andrea. And Andrea brings up a very good question. It's one that I have heard others ask about, so I know that this is important to other people as well. And so Andrea says, I'm not saying my battery is not charging. Okay. Andrea asks, is there a good way to work through the anger that shadow work brings up in some people? She said, I have a hard time working through the anger, a harder time working through the anger than I do through the other emotions that come up during my shadow work. So very good question. A lot of people have asked me about how do I deal with anger. It's one of those emotions that, we definitely don't want to tamp it down and stifle it. Energy just continues to build. What we resist persists. So our energy needs an outlet in some way, and that's not just ignoring it. And I think that people who come to shadow work, and Andrea realizes this because she's answering the question or asking the question, but people intuitively know this is an energy that I can't keep it inside for very long, right? Or it eats away at us. It causes health problems. It can cause physical problems, mental problems, spiritual problems. And so it's a very good question. So I have several ideas that I think can help manage the anger, but mostly it's not so much about managing it, it's about finding an outlet for it. So my first suggestion is breath work, because it's the simplest thing that a person can do. It doesn't take anything. It doesn't take a lot of effort. It just takes the knowledge of what the breaths are and knowing which ones work for which energies and which emotions. So the first breath is the Satali Pranayam, and this is called this is the curled tongue breath. I sometimes call it, people will call it, and I call it sipping breath as well. And it's a very good breath for cooling anger. It's literally prescribed by practitioners for people who want to bring their anger down. And it's very cooling. You'll even feel the cooling air in your mouth. As an added benefit, people say that it's very anti-aging, in particular for women who are going through perimenopause or menopause. It can help with the internal heat, and it can actually, some people say it can actually stave off menopause for a while, and people or make the transition easier. So it's just all around for anybody, it's a good breath, but especially for tamping down some anger or getting some of that anger out. Now, the way it works is you curl your tongue if you can. That is a genetic thing. Not everybody can do it. I can't. But if you can curl your tongue, you'll curl your tongue, stick it out of your mouth. Now, you'll take a deep inhale through that curled tongue. And then you close your mouth and you exhale very deeply through the nose. And you do that for as long as you need to. Many people will say for 3 minutes. Just a minute will be highly beneficial. Now, if you can't curl your tongue, then I call it, like I say, it's like a sipping breath. So you're just going to imagine you're sipping air through a straw. I like to do a count here. I count like 6 to 8 counts as I very slowly sip in the air. And then close your mouth and exhale slowly through the nose. So you do that for a couple minutes, and you may find, hopefully, that your anger comes down a little bit. And that's why we call it a cooling breath. Now, another really good breath besides the Tali Pranayam is the Brahmari breath. Brahmari breath is great for your throat chakra, but it's also very good for calming, in particular, anxiety, but I think it's also good for anger. And so what you do is you'll close off your ears with your fingers, and then you're going to take a deep inhale, and on the exhale, you'll make a buzzing noise on the exhale. So it looks kind of like this. And then when you get to the bottom of that breath, you would inhale and you would do it again. And you can do this for a minute, 3 minutes. Very good in combination with Satali Pranayam. When you really do press down on your ears, that sound will go internally into your head, and it tends to have a very calming effect. It has an added benefit because of the throat chakra connection. It allows you to sometimes say the things you need to say. So if you're struggling with getting your truth out or saying what needs to be said, you can try that breath and it can help. And then finally, there's the lion's breath. The lion's breath to me is so fantastic for anger. When I was quitting my job last year, and I had so much anger coming up around being abused in that job, and then faced with what the person in charge did afterwards, or threatened me and things like that. And I used this breath a lot, and a lot of people love it. It looks crazy, so you just have to sort of get over yourself. But what you do is you take a very deep inhale, and then on the exhale, stick out your tongue, and you make a hissing noise. And some people bug out their eyes and make a crazy face, but if you do that breath a couple of times, it can be very good at getting anger out. Now, besides the breath work, I think a few other ways, we need to find ways to channel the anger that are positive. And so one way we can channel is into physical activity. And this is what the key here, though, is to find physical activity that is not a chore. So I hear a lot of people being like, I have to run. No, you have to find a physical activity that you enjoy. And I thought the same thing. I had to run. I didn't like running. I never enjoyed it one day in my life. If you love it, great. But for those of you who don't, find an activity that you love and do that activity. I like to climb. I do a lot of mountain hiking and climbing mountains. And for me, there's a lot of yang energy that I can discharge when I'm doing that. And when I'm really angry, that's what I'll do. I'll go climb a mountain. So find something that you can get that energy out. Martial arts is great. Something where you can get that physical energy out and channel it into something that is more productive. Other ways to channel is through activism. Activism, we can be pissed off about something, and sometimes that thing that we're mad about is something that we can change through activism, or we can at least feel like we're fighting against it. And so when I was much younger, I became vegan very early on, or vegetarian and then vegan. Had a lot of anger about animal cruelty, and I channeled that energy into activism. And I would volunteer at like animal rights festivals. I helped get signatures for a proposition that was going to change the lives of farm animals. And so we can find ways, whatever we're angry about, we can find ways to channel that into activism. But sometimes we can channel our anger into art or music. And you don't have to be an artist or a musician to use that technique, but you can channel it into making a collage, or coloring, or scribbling, right? Sometimes people will like draw their shadow and then scribble all over it, as they're trying to get some of their anger out. And then the other thing we can do is, and I would suggest this because the channeling helps us get it out, but we also want to explore, where does the anger come from in our shadow work? We want to explore why is that an emotion that's harder to let go of than others. And that can really deepen our experience of our shadow work and of our own anger. And I kind of suggest doing all of it, doing some of the breath work in the immediate, doing some channeling, channel it into something positive kind of as a larger goal, and then underneath it trying to explore, well, what is it about anger that's so difficult to let go of? So I hope that helps. And then Annie, Annie Lynn asked a question about protection. And in particular, she said, I need help finding a way to protect our property from negative um, energy or spirits. So I think that for me, I think when it comes to protecting a property, the witch's bottle is one of the best things to do. We do have an episode on protection magic that I did like 2 weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think. And so I'm going to share that in the chat as well. And those who are watching, will watch on YouTube later. This will be, this will also be below the video. And for some reason, I can't share it right now. But once I can share this, I'm going to put this, okay, so this is the episode on protection magic, and it's going to go into more detail of some of the things I'm going to talk about. But I think that the witch's bottle is one of the best ways to protect property. I have one outside of my house. To make a witch's bottle, you get a mason jar. You can go and watch that episode for a deeper explanation of it. And you fill it with kind of undesirable things, broken glass, rusty nails. Some people take fingernails, hair, blood, menstrual blood, pee. Some people pee in it. Cat fur, animals that live on your property, things like that, black salt. And you put all this stuff in the bottle and then you bury it at some entry, near some entry point to the property. So I think that's a really effective way. It's one of my favorite ways to protect a property. And by the way, anybody who lives in an apartment can also use this. Because even if you don't have a yard where you can bury it, you can get a really big planter, fill it with dirt, and bury it there, and then put it near the entryway of the apartment or the condo. Another thing is making sigils, and especially if you're trying to protect like a property, you could make protective sigils and you could draw them on the trees, or you could draw them places around the house. A lot of times when we do sigils, they're destructible and we burn them. You can also do that. But if you want to have some permanent sigils on your property, I've heard very positive experiences from people who have done this, who've protected homes from natural disasters through using sigil magic. So you can, in that other episode here from a couple weeks ago, I also talk about sigils and that. You can make a magical sachet as well and protect a home. I love doing that. You can put stones and herbs of protection in a piece of cloth, tie it up with a ribbon. You can hang it above your doorway or the entryway of the home. And that's a great way to protect your property and your home. And then some people are a little put off when I say this, but if you are someone who bleeds cyclically, you can save some of your menstrual blood and you can put that near an entryway of the property. And witches of old, they poured their blood into the earth as a way of like creating the sustenance of the earth, but it was also a protective measure. So, and then finally, you can work with deities of protection and warrior deities, and some that come to mind that I really like for this is Kali, the Morrigan, and Macha. But any god or goddess that has a protective aspect or kind of a warrior aspect can very much be called upon for this kind of magic. So I hope that helps. And now I'm going into the chat, and I wanted to see if there's anything anybody's left here in the chat. And I see that Elizabeth had said railroad spikes in the four corners of the property is also a very good way for protection magic. Sometimes people will also put like salt at the four corners of the property as well. But yeah, there's a lot of great ways, and we'd love to hear other techniques from people that I didn't mention. Okay, Andrea said, is there an archetype you recommend to work with if you usually only work with female deities? Yes. So do you mean another female archetype, or do you mean a god archetype that you would want? Are you asking about a god that you would recommend, or that I would recommend? If that's the question, I think that one of the easiest gods to work with is Ganesha. I've turned a lot of people onto him. He's a very open god to work with. It's very easy to work with him, and he can sometimes change the way that people experience deity, especially if they've only worked with female deities. And remember, you don't have to work with the divine masculine, but it can help you find more balance within when you at least explore some of those energies. But I like Ganesha, and then I think, when it comes to other male deities to work with, I would sort of explore some of their stories. Like, you can get a book like The Witch's God, and you can explore just some of the mythology. And if there's a deity that you really find that you're connected to when you read their myths, that would also be one to begin to explore more deeply. Anthony said he finds it interesting he's drawn to so many goddesses after leaving the Catholic Church. It doesn't surprise me. It's like, it's very, very, very common. People experience trauma, and then they go, they get drawn here because of the goddess, and so it's very common. But as we branch back out and start to explore that a little bit more deeply, sometimes the gods can help us do that. Elizabeth said with abandonment issues from her dad, she finds it hard to connect to any gods except for Hermes. Yeah, and so when you find one that you really connect to, that can be a strong anchor. She said, I would really like to work with Hephaestus. And she said, now that I've outlined the forage gods, and she said, I work with Demeter and Medusa, so I don't think Poseidon is really an option for me. Yeah, and that's the other thing too, is if you work with deities that have issues with other deities, you don't want to bring those ones in. You want to find ones that are easier, that seem easier to work with. And that's why I often will recommend Ganesha to people, because of the ease of working with him. Okay, there's a lot of comments here. Okay. I may have to go back through these comments later and take a look at them, because I feel like I'm missing some of them. Okay, so in the interest of time, we're going to move forward, and I just want to tell you guys about what's coming up. I think I got most of the questions. I see people are giving some very good advice about protection magic in the chat, which is awesome. Keep it coming. But let's talk about what's coming up. So I think that next week on 11/19, we're going to have an episode on magical self-care. Sometimes we think about self-care as not being magical, but it absolutely can be. So we're going to talk about some practices that we can use. I think these are beneficial to us given, state of the world right now, and also as we move into the holiday season. Thanksgiving and Christmas are hard. They're hard for people. Especially if you have issues with your family and there's disconnects between religion, right? Or you have to hide your religion. And so some of these self-care practices can help prepare us for those family gatherings if we have to attend them. So that will be coming up on 11/19 rather. I don't have an episode planned yet for 11/26, but I will tell you that on 11/27, we are going to have a free workshop called Introduction to Shadow Work for Witches, Empaths, and Spiritually Minded People. And you can join me live on Zoom. It's a little bit different than these lives on Facebook, so you'll have a chance to kind of be face-to-face and ask questions. And then right after that workshop, we are going to open up our Shadow Seekers membership to take in new members. So that's in 2 weeks coming up on Wednesday the 29th. And you can watch our YouTube and our Body, Mind, Witchcraft Facebook group. And if you're on our mailing list, you can also watch for that and get more information about how you can join us live. And of course, there will also be a replay afterwards. Okay, so I'm going to go back and I'll look at all these comments later, but I'm going to sign off for now. If it was always, as always, it's always so awesome to spend Tuesday evenings with some of you. I always look forward to these lives. If you enjoy what you hear, leave a heart, a thumbs up somewhere in the video. It helps us get it out in the feed of more people. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Body, Mind, Witchcraft, so you will not miss any future episodes. And again, you can leave questions and comments, even if you're watching in replay. I'll go back in and I will answer those afterwards, okay? And until next time, blessed be.